But first, in just a few hours, the Senate will vote on advancing a straightforward piece of legislation to protect newborn babies. This legislation is simple. It would simply require that medical professionals give the same standard care and medical treatment to newborn babies who've survived an attempted abortion as any other newborn baby would receive in any other circumstance. It isn't about new restrictions on abortion. It isn't about changing the options available to women. It's just about recognizing that a newborn baby is a newborn baby, period. This bill would make clear that in the United States of America in the year 2019, the medical professionals on hand when a baby is born alive need to maintain their basic ethical and professional responsibilities to that newborn. It would make sure our laws reflect the fact that the human rights of newborn boys and girls are innate. They don't come and go based on the circumstances of birth. Whatever the circumstances, if that medical professional comes face to face with a baby who's been born alive, they're looking at a human being with human rights, period. To be frank, Mr. President, it makes me uneasy that such a basic statement seems to be generating actual disagreement. Can the extreme far-left politics surrounding abortion really have come this far? Are we really supposed to think that it's normal that there are now two sides debating whether newborn living babies deserve medical attention? We already know that many of our Democratic colleagues want the United States to remain one of the 7 nations in the world that permits elective abortions after 20 weeks. 7 countries, including North Korea, China, and the United States of America. But now it seems the far left wants to push the envelope even further. Apart from the entire abortion debate, they now seem to be suggesting that newborn babies' right to life may be contingent on the circumstances surrounding their birth. Well, evidently, the far left is no longer convinced that all babies are created equal. But the rest of us are still pretty fond of that principle. So my colleagues across the aisle need to decide where they'll take their cues on these moral questions. On the one hand, there are a few extreme voices who've decided that some newborn lives are more disposable than others. On the other side is the entire rest of the country. I would urge my colleagues, let's listen to the voices of the American people. Let's reaffirm that. Let's reaffirm that when we say every life is created equal, we actually mean it. Let's vote to advance the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act later today.
Short time ago on Capitol Hill, a defeat for a pro-life bill on the Senate floor. This bill was very specific. It only would protect infants who survived abortions at the end of the term by requiring healthcare officials to treat them with the same degree and skill and care that they would of any other baby. But it was short of the 60 votes needed to advance. Joining me now is the author of that abortion survivors bill, Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse. Senator, thank you very much for being here tonight. Your thoughts on your bill, which I know you feel very strongly about.
I do feel strongly about this. This is about the most simple thing you can say, which is that a baby is a baby, and they have dignity and they have worth, and it's not because they're powerful, it's because they're babies. And so today is a sad day in the United States Senate, but I remain hopeful long term because ultimately the United States Senate today could have a bunch of people, 44 of our members, decided to try to stick their head in the sand and pretend that a baby isn't a baby. But 320 million Americans are going to have conversations around their kitchen table that are going to be more loving and logical, and in the long term I think that this is going to head in the right direction. But today's a sad day.
Were you surprised? Was there anybody who voted against this that you had spoken to who you thought maybe was going to be on board?
I'm surprised at all 44 people who voted no, frankly, because the way this bill was characterized by the big abortion industry shows how desperate they are, because they just lied constantly about the bill. And we heard, I think, 6 floor speeches from opponents of my legislation, and I think 4 of them were filled with just this blatant nonsense that had nothing to do with anything that was in the text of the bill. So I'm surprised at all 44 no votes. Condemning infanticide should be a unanimous vote. It should be a basic human rights issue.
What was the argument? What do you think was the most common misunderstanding, as you would see it, in terms of the way they, decided to vote no?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of the people who opposed the bill that spoke against it today claimed that it would end abortion, that it would stand between a woman and her doctor. And I am a very pro-life guy. That is true. I'm unapologetically pro-life. But that's not what this bill was actually about. This bill didn't touch anything having to do with abortion access or Roe v. Wade. This is about babies that had already been born and were alive out of the womb, gasping for breath on a table. And so almost everybody who spoke against the bill just made up stuff claiming that it limited abortion. There were a few people who tried to draw an active-passive distinction about how babies are killed once they're born alive, and they would say things like, well, nobody's taking a pillow and putting it over the face of the little baby and suffocating her. That's true. They're letting them die by exposure, by backing away from the table, the same way the Aztecs and the Greeks used to take babies that had physical deformities and leave them on the mountainside and let them die by exposure.
I mean, it reminds everyone of what we heard Governor Northam say in Virginia about, after the child is born, there's a discussion that ensues between the doctor and the parent. And I had a guest here last week or so, a young man who was born without arms, who his parents faced the same exact decision, and he's gone on to live a really full life. But he says that the doctors turned to his mother and said, "What would you like us to do?" I just want to put up a poll. This is a Marist poll that shows actually there's some interesting movement, according to this one poll that shows the pro-life has gone from 38% in January to 47% now in their most recent read. Do you think that number is accurate, and why do you think that change might be happening?
I think the American people are having more interesting conversations around their dinner table than is happening in the United States Senate. The Senate fancies itself the greatest deliberative body in the world, but today there was so much nonsense thrown around. I think one of the most interesting things in the pro-life movement more broadly, and again, to distinguish, today was an anti-infanticide vote. This wasn't really about abortion, but in the pro-life movement more broadly, one of the things you find is that the more people are exposed to sonogram technology and to images of what's actually happening in utero, you know what they find out? That a 3D image of a baby shows a baby. And if you see a baby, you tend to think that a baby has dignity and worth and rights, and that we don't just get to decide to kill a baby. And so I think the pro-life movement is going to be the way of the future, because there's more and more images and more imaging technology becoming available.
I think you're right about that. In terms of where this goes next, is there a next chapter for your bill? We rewrite it. What will you do? And also, how much of an impact does this debate that you rightly point out is just getting a lot more attention, and people are starting to look at it differently, I think. How much of this plays in the presidential election, do you think?
I don't know. I'm one of 8 people out of 100 in the Senate who's never been a politician before, so I don't pretend to be any good at horse racing or handicapping that. But it feels like a third of the Democratic caucus in the Senate is currently running for president, and almost all of them declared their candidacy by saying they stand for the voiceless, they stand for the most vulnerable, they stand for the weakest and the neediest among us. And today they had a chance to actually cast a vote for those little boys and girls who really are the most vulnerable and the weakest and the neediest among us. And it turned out that was just a whole bunch of rhetoric and a bunch of nonsense about what they actually believed. And I think the American people are going to notice that kind of thing. This shouldn't be about politics, though. This should be far beyond Republican versus Democrat. This should be about having a heart. And if you see a baby, you think a baby deserves care, and we have an obligation to provide care for those helpless little babies. And I think in the future, that's where we're going to end up.
Senator Sass, thank you. Always good
Thanks,
to speak
Martha.
with you, sir. Good to see you tonight. And thanks.
You too.